Well, let's continue our examination of the art of photography. And I have to begin with an obvious question on this particular presentation topic. Does photojournalism count as an art form? And that is a very open-ended, serious question. I'm not going to try to argue for one or the other. That's a question that I want all of us to ask ourselves during this presentation and kind of see what we can conclude at the end during the Q&A. Some in the journalistic space deny any connection to art because that would imply that journalists, whether with a camera or a pen, are creating news. When we look at some of the dramatic images captured by photojournalists, especially during war, we get a sense that something more than mere reporting is happening. And it's here where the controversy lies. Anthony Tomasini of the New York Times says that, quote, art may be hard to define, but whatever art is, it's a step removed from reality. A theatrical depiction of suffering may be art. Real suffering is not. The image of a naked, fleeing, napalm-burned Vietnamese girl is truth, not art. Images of the blazing Twin Towers, however horrifically compelling, are not art. So I'll begin with that quote and that perspective, and then I'll end today with the opposite perspective. Well, despite what Tomasini says, photographs in this book have been touring the world and most often are exhibited in art museums. So why is that? During this presentation, we're going to explore this question: is photojournalism an art form? And we'll start from its earliest days. We won't get past World War I. So we're going to stay in those early days. The pioneer of photojournalism was Englishman Roger Fenton, who covered the Crimean War. And he often took images of officers in very casual moments, trying to humanize them. Or he took pictures of these officers and their soldiers' fate. For the first time, photographers were bringing out strong emotional responses to war, but images like this, let's face it, are primarily documentations of the war. A co-founder of the Royal British Photographic Society, Roger Fenton was also an accomplished landscape photographer, a skill he employed often in the Crimean War. So take a look at this image. Look at the title. This stark landscape with its ominous title has only one unnatural object in it, and that is the road is littered with cannonballs. There was one subject of war that Fenton would not literally depict, and that was the dead. Fenton believed it too undignified. So there is no formally living object in this image, but Fenton has strongly alluded to the devastation of death and destruction of war. So let me ask you, by alluding to such an idea in this stark image with the, I guess you could say, the symbol of the cannonball, has Fenton become more than a mere documenter of war? Has he become more like an artist? One of the first photojournalists that some of you may know about, or at least have seen his photos, is the American Civil War photographer Matthew Brady, pictured here. And that is his photo outfit that you see. Very large camera, as well as a processing little, I guess, cart as well, where he could develop his film on glass plates. Brady used what is called the wet plate or collodion process, which used a large, heavy camera. This system required the people being photographed, get this, to remain still for 4 to 10 seconds, which is why you never see action shots from the Civil War. The image was actually exposed onto a large plate of glass, and it had to be developed within 15 minutes, which meant the photographer had to have a portable field darkroom with him. Photographers of the American Civil War, like Brady and his associates, were willing, unlike Fenton, to document the dead and the brutality of war. This was the first time the public had been confronted with the brutal reality of war. Are such authentic, truthful displays of war art? Remember that quote we began with from Anthony Tomasini? He would say no. But the New York Times stated, Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war with these graphic images of the dead. Well, for some in the public, such images were too terrible and earnest and too much to be considered art. Brady took portraits of all the major players of the war. Now, is this that you see here simply documenting an historical figure? Are these portraits simply likenesses? I'll let you decide for yourselves. Some of you know the biographies of Abraham Lincoln and of Ulysses S. Grant and of Robert E. Lee. You know what they were like. But even if you didn't know their biographies, I think from these portraits, you could guess some details about what kind of character they had. Because these portraits reveal, in my opinion, the truth of their subjects. Abraham Lincoln was a depressive who, despite this disability, exhibited amazing courage in pursuing emancipation, even if it meant civil war and eventually his own death. Grant, there in the middle, was a gutsy general, but a little rough around the edges, you could say, due to his alcoholism. Not much for style, he was quite effective because he was not a general who hesitated at all in battle. And then there's Robert E. Lee on the right. He was your traditional Southern aristocrat, but also a man of great courage and personal strength. How has Brady done in capturing the traits of each of these men? And does his ability to capture these traits require of him to be an artist? Give you a moment with this. Though striking, such images as this one show the limitations of photographers during the war. It does depict the gruesome result of battle, and sure, it tells the harsh tale of the indignity of war. Certainly, it communicates that. But traditional artists like painters still had a major advantage when it came to war images because they could depict action scenes. Because of the lengthy exposure times for cameras during the middle of the 19th century, action photography wasn't really possible during the war. Compare the graphic depiction of the results of war in the previous photograph that you just saw with this commercial art depicting the Battle of Antietam and the Civil War. From an emotional and psychological perspective, and perhaps from an aesthetic concern as well, which is more artistic, the photo or the drawn and hand-colored image? Which is more dramatic? Take a good long look at this, and then I'll show you the photo again. I'll move on, but I just wanted to get you thinking and trying to come up with your own perspective, which I'll hope you'll share in the Q&A. Though they couldn't capture the actions of war, photographers could ask soldiers to stay still for a few moments and pose. One of Brady's proteges was Andrew Gardner, who took some of the earliest images of the dead during war. His photos of the dead soldiers after the Battle of Antietam had a dramatic impact on the public who saw them. Obviously, one of the advantages of photographing the dead were the dead didn't move. But in order to capture an image of the burial of the dead like this one, he had to get the men, the soldiers, to pose still for 10 seconds. Take a moment with this work. Some of you who are painters will immediately be struck by one part of this image. Look at the layout, the layout of these soldiers. Now, the photographer did not stage these dead soldiers out in this pattern, but he did choose this perspective to take his photograph. This curvature that you see is a popular one among artists. This is a painting by Hudson River School artist Thomas Cole. Notice the curvature of the left bank of the river. Just notice how this painting takes your eyesight through the image because of that curvature. It's the same line that the dead soldiers make. Artists know what moves the eye well through a painting and through a photograph. Another one of Brady's associates during the war was Timothy O'Sullivan, who captured one of the most dramatic images of the Civil War. The sniper's rifle leans against the rocks. See that? Now, was that natural, or did the photographer prop it up? It doesn't matter. The rebel sniper himself is laying dead at the base of the large stone. I think the rugged texture of the rocks was captured so vividly that it seems to say something about the cold, ragged life of this soldier and his harsh death now. By World War I, cameras had become more portable, and developing technology allowed more freedom and choice for photographers on the final outcome of the image. Ernest Brooks was the first official photographer to be appointed by the British military. He is shown somewhere on the Western Front with the Goetz Anschutz plate camera. Now, even though that may seem large to us, it was a huge advance to what those like Brady had to deal with in the Civil War. With the new camera, exposure times were shortened considerably. For the first time, images showing the action of war could be taken. Now, images like this document the war, but is there any artistic quality to them? Just take a brief moment to decide before I move on. Now compare these images to this one. This is an amazing shot, I think we'd all agree. Serendipitous from an artistic point of view to have seen those barren and naked trees barely standing amidst the crawling soldiers. Another serendipitous moment for the photographer. Look at the perspective, the positioning required of the photographer. Just the right spot, I'd say. A smart choice as far as both storytelling and artistic considerations. I'm not sure who the photographer was for this dramatic image. But though showing an action scene from the war, is it purely documentation or is it something more? Here's a little bit of information for you that will help maybe. I found this commentary regarding this photograph in a New York Times article on the photography of the Great War. The comment reads, although the original caption from an agency photo archive describes a German officer leading his men through a cloud of phosgene gas as they run toward the British trenches, This image is almost certainly from training behind the lines. Well, we do know that early in the war, there was creative license taken with naming the photographs. We also know that for a time, Ernest Brooks and some other official photographers even staged some of their images. Now, that was considered fine during the Civil War because of the lengthy exposure times of the cameras then. But armed with short exposure times so that real action of the war was now available, such photojournalists as Brooks were reprimanded for staging and altering titles and presented with orders to cease and desist the practice. Hilary Roberts, the photography curator at the Imperial War Museums in London and co-author of the book, The Great War of Photographic Narrative, said, "The First World War is the conflict in which the concept of documentary truth first evolved." Documentary truth. In 1916, Britain introduced a policy known as propaganda of the facts. That's an interesting title. Propaganda of the facts, which banned staged or faked images. So let's look at some other images from World War I and judge whether the photographer is strictly representing the facts or artistic choices being made. Is this photograph by Brooks simply documentation? Could it possibly be composition, as Mike Hamers mentioned in the chat this morning? Well, look at that sky above these silhouetted soldiers. What story might Brooks be either capturing or be telling with this image? How about this one? There's that curved line again. Of course, this image was not staged. But what about this one? Perhaps photographer Brooks was just walking by when he saw this event and ran to a spot to gain the perfect perspective and then took this photograph. Or perhaps that he had acknowledged doing at some points during the World War I. Perhaps the photographer asked the soldier to go up this little mound where the burial cross was and stand just so, and then he took the picture. We might say if it was the first scenario, then the photographer may have had an artful eye, but he was mainly documenting. But if it was the latter scenario, we would say the photographer is acting very much like an artist. But could we call it photojournalism? Because the photographer wasn't capturing the literal truth of the moment. Or was he? What is truth in art and photojournalism? You've heard me say this many times, artists must lie in order to tell the truth. But is a photojournalist allowed such freedom with the facts? And what degree of difference is there in a photographer having an artful eye to capture the truth of a moment versus having the artistic imagination to create a scene, compose a scene, that contains some more expansive, larger truth about war? Well, in my research, I found a nice article on the Knight Foundation website, that's Knight with a K, which promotes excellence in journalism, as well as promoting free expression, arts and culture and community, as well as conducting research in areas of media and democracy. And the article I found on that website was written by Eric Newton and published on February 10th, 2014. Eric took the exact opposite perspective of Anthony Tomasini, and here are 4 of his arguments on 4 slides. And after reading each slide, I'd like us to ask ourselves whether we agree or not. Eric Newton's 4 reasons why photojournalism is art. For centuries, well, realism is art, is what he says. For centuries, sculptors and painters have depicted pain. About suffering, they were never wrong, wrote poet W.H. Auden. The old masters, how well they understood its human position, how it takes place. In the early days of photojournalism, New York crowds thronged to galleries to see Civil War images taken by Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner. Newspapers of the day lacked the technology to print photos, so Americans lost the romantic image they had of war in exhibit halls. The New York Times wrote then of hushed, reverent groups gathered to look in the pale faces of the dead, chained by the strange spell that dwells in dead men's eyes. Take a moment to digest that before I move on to his second reason, that photojournalism is art. Second reason is photojournalism is creative. Carol Guzzi, 4-time Pulitzer winner with the Washington Post and the Miami Herald, says good pictures come from the ability to open your mind a little bit and see differently. News photographers produce their art within the space of a fraction of a second, the fleeting instant in which photographer, camera, image, and subject all fall into place, a moment that is either frozen indelibly or forever lost. So it's not just art, it's difficult art to create, often done so under the most dangerous of circumstances. So take a moment to reflect on that argument. Third, photojournalism withstands the test of time. One of the photos in the Pulitzer exhibit is Joe Rosenthal's images of Marines raising a flag at Iwo Jima, an American icon for 70 years. The picture was transformed into the US Marine Corps War Memorial. No one would debate that the sculpture is art. Why debate its photographic progenitor? Art elevates the ordinary. A moment on a battlefield becomes a memorial. In Newton's final argument, photojournalism moves us. A good photograph, Vietnam War photographer Eddie Adams used to say, reaches into your chest and tears your heart out. What it does with your heart after that depends upon the picture. You might cry to music, marvel at dance, or puzzle over a painting. Or you might feel all of that at a photojournalism exhibit. News photographs speak in a universal language that ignores national and cultural borders. They carry big ideas into our souls. So what do you think about Eric Newton's arguments? How much artistic license do we grant photojournalists? Or are some photojournalists capable of art without need of artistic license? And how much does it matter to you either way? I think these questions have relevance for us who feel that art, and perhaps literature and poetry as forms of art, are revelatory to a degree. These conduits of revelation inspire us morally, captivate us emotionally, catalyze us spiritually, and heal us psychologically. So issues around truth in art is important to us. But does art, literature, poetry, etc., require a little artistic license in order to tell larger truths? Let's just say, for argument, that photojournalism may require a balance of literal truth with other levels of truth-telling. Wouldn't that make it all the more remarkable of an artistic medium, and therefore a very fitting subject for an exhibition at our finest art institutions as they are now?